Thank you very much, Sally. So welcome everybody. So my name is Jerome Billeter. I'm the corporate business manager at the HousingLIN. So you're probably surprised not to see Jeremy on screen today. So he's been, I'm standing in today for him as he's attending the first session of the inquiry into regeneration of outdated sheltered housing, which is chaired by Lord Best. So we'll report on that in the coming days. But to discuss today's happy hour. So today's happy hour coincide with this week's Learning Disability Awareness Week. And the theme of today's session is trauma-informed design, which builds on a previous happy hour session, which we ran with Learning Disability England earlier this year, and which saw the launch of research entitled Housing for People with Learning Disabilities, Renting Your Own Place. So yeah, a lot of the HousingLIN current work relates to learning disability, really. We're building on the work of our consultancy has done and is doing on the Renting Your Own Place report and other consultancy projects, which include the Learning Disability and Autism Housing Network, and HousingLIN research about supported housing for people with learning disability and autistic people in England. And this will be, the finding from this research will be launched early next month at the House of Lords. And we look forward to reporting on this research in due time. So stay tuned and we'll let you know about it. But now to get back to today's happy hour. We're delighted to host today's session really with our friends and sponsors, Catherine and Mark from West Waddy Archadia, who've just published a new brief on trauma-informed design, which is a brief that aims to inform a framework for trauma-informed design that can be applied to both new build and existing properties through combining the disciplines of psychology and architecture. So it can be found on the learning disability topic page of our website, and Sally will post a URL to this brief in the chat box. Also joining us today, we're really excited to welcome fantastic guest speakers, Jill and Patricia. So Jill is a professor with the Interior Architecture and Design Department at Florida State University. And she facilitates design resources for homelessness, which is a non-profit resource offering research-informed practical design strategies. She is a TEDx Florida State University speaker and co-author of Homelessness and the Built Environment, Designing for Unhoused Person, which was awarded 2022 Interior Design Educators Council National Book Honor. Then we have Patricia. Patricia is a clinical psychologist with background in working primarily with learning disabilities in health and care settings. So her clinical interests have included work with children and adults with learning disabilities and neurodivergence, diagnostic assessment, emotion dysregulation, attachment disorder, and a trauma-informed approach. She currently works for Empowered Homes, who are specialist property developers, to build supported living schemes that are informed by psychological theory and a broad understanding of trauma and its stress reaction. Patricia also sits on the advisory group for the UK's PI-Link, responsible for facilitating nationwide communication between all those working with the psychological and emotional needs of people who are homeless, and those experiencing trauma. So Jill and Patricia will start the session. Then Catherine will and Mark will also give their presentation. So Catherine and Mark, you probably already know them. They've spoken in many of our events before. But Catherine is a fully qualified project architect, leading projects through REBA stages 0 to 7. She has worked on projects ranging in size from domestic extensions to a large housing scheme. She leads the practice-based research program working closely with council and universities, and continues to broaden her knowledge and expertise in specialist fields, sitting on the board of Women in Social Housing, and she's an active member of the HousingLIN. Additionally, Catherine is vice chair of the Access Association London and co-chair of Women in Social Housing London. She has won Future Leader Awards and SECBE and Oxprop. Mark, also from West Waddy Archadia, is a design director and heads up West Waddy Archadia London office. He leads on the specialist housing at the practice, which includes older persons, housing, and housing for people with disabilities, and several of his projects in these sectors have won awards. He has a keen interest in sustainable, accessible design and has presented on this topic for different audiences, including the RIBA and HousingLIN. Right, so we are going to start the session now with Jill. So just as Sally was explaining at the start of the session, so if you have any questions, we'd ask that you post them in the Q&A box. So while the speakers are giving their presentation, if you can post your questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll reconvene after the 4 presentations for a Q&A. Okay, over to you, Jill.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and hi to you from across the pond, calling in from the United States today. It's a pleasure to be here with you. As Jerome said, my name is Jill Pobley, and I am an interior designer by profession, but my area of research for the last 15 years or so has been environments for people who are experiencing homelessness. So it's my honor today to kind of kick us off and to give some opening comments about built environment and also trauma-informed design and its application. Next slide, please. So why are we talking about physical setting, and what good can that do for health? Well, a lot of people, a lot of researchers are finding evidence that built spaces have a huge influence on people's moods and perceptions, how they see the world, and even how they see their own self. It also provides an impression of a support organization's vitality in its organization and so forth. So there's many reasons we should care about the links between health and physical setting. Next slide, please. So in general, there's a lot of research that's showing that the housing and its quality of its built environment is really associated quite strongly with morbidity and also diseases, injuries, mental disorders, and so forth. So there's very good reasons we should consider built environment a partner in how we are assisting other people through their situation. Next slide, please. More specifically, there's a few research studies out there, actually more than a few, that look at links between standard of living, social protections, as we might think of as housing and so forth, and those who have mental conditions, that these are actually, large influencers on somebody's state of being. Stress, too, which can sadly accompany somebody who is in various states, including those with learning disabilities, has very real and trackable cardiovascular, immune system, and other types of ailments that built environment has a say in. So again, we need to be looking at this issue. Next slide, please. And then lastly, of course, depression is also sadly linked to risk of suicide, chronic diseases, and so forth. So depression also is related to built environment and how the quality of environment is actually anticipating people's needs. The photos I'm sharing with you are some examples of shelters, supportive housing, and other spaces that I visited or worked on here in the United States and also in the United Kingdom that are starting to look at and applying trauma-informed design. Next slide. So all in all, really the goal should be for our physical architecture to really anticipate where people are. And that where they are is going to vary a great deal by their background, their goals, priorities, and values. And it needs to attend to that in a psychological, a physical, and an emotional space. So the charge here is very large, but it's no less important. Next slide, please. It's not just researchers that are saying this. My travels to various shelters throughout the United States and also the United Kingdom is showing me that program directors themselves are finding that alterations they make to the physical environment is a full partner in a wraparound strategy to help people to be their best selves. For example, here's an example on the left of a day room at a day center in Burlington, Vermont. And then after trauma-informed design principles were applied on the right, the director of this shelter shared these photographs with me, and also the quote above, that the absence of clutter, the ability to think clearly and so forth is directly related to the physical status of the built environment. So there's many things: color, light, pattern, organizations, wayfinding, space planning, and so forth, that all play into this quite often in a psychological and subconscious level. Next slide, please. So one resource I'd like to share with you in our brief time together here is Design Resources for Homelessness. This is a free downloadable series of reports, and you can see the website at the upper right there. Then I'll tell you a bit about each of those in just a moment. But all of their resources from this nonprofit organization are free and available for download. They can help you in your own thinking, help you in making presentations to others as you wish to apply trauma-informed design to your projects. Next slide. Among its findings that you might find interesting is a review of research. What can we find from the research of neuroscience, social work, psychology, architecture, interior design, and other fields that support and help define how we can design thoughtfully and well for people? And also a report specifically dedicated to trauma-informed design. What does that look like? And I'll be sharing some of those high points in just a moment with you. Next slide. Also, there's a series of what's called spotlight reports: how to design spaces for specific population groups who might be experiencing homelessness. For example, you all are quite concerned with persons with learning disabilities, but these spotlight reports also highlight other areas as well: adolescents, persons, seniors, victims of domestic violence, and so forth. While I don't have a report specifically for people with learning disabilities, I like to think that such a report might be on the way at some point soon with some partners that might produce something for us all to use. Next slide, please. There's also a series of case studies, both here in the United States and also in the United Kingdom, that shows trauma-informed design applied in a whole diverse series of ways, that you can go and do a virtual visit to one of these spaces to learn and perhaps apply some of the ideas to your own projects. Next slide. Looking specifically at trauma-informed design, our approach at Design Resources for Homelessness relates to these 6 fundamental human needs, as we call them. Through my research and the research of others, we've been able to determine that many of the housing sorts of contributions that it can make to somebody's state of mind and health probably relate to one of these 6. So therefore, it sort of serves as a framework as how we can design. Next slide. So I'll take you through each of these in turn. Dignity and self-esteem can take many forms. Here you can see an excerpt from one of the case studies that shows a single room apartment and shows some of the contributions that styles of furniture, bathroom layout, approach to the front door, and so forth can practically apply and support somebody's dignity and self-esteem. I'm fascinated that many of these techniques are very, very small and don't necessarily cost a lot. So there's much to be learned by looking at other people's work. Next slide. Secondly, empowerment and personal control play a large part in taking steps to overcome trauma. For example, here on the left, you can see a small sign that's posted next to these sleeping pods for women at a space in Seattle that lets them change the sign from stop to go to let them have a measure of control over whether they're accepting visitors that day. Does not cost very much, but probably increases a sense of personal autonomy and determination. Next slide. The third of the human needs is security, privacy, and personal space. Many different ways this can be expressed. Here you can see an example of a day room at a apartment complex in Los Angeles. And on the left, you see a space that is sort of a breakout space. You see the entrance to that space on the right through those open doors. It's a space that lets somebody kind of lurk nearby, but gives them the ability to change their space to have a modicum of privacy and so forth. So there's space finding and space planning things we can do that can support people in that moment, however they're feeling. Next slide. Stress management is a big one as well. Here we go to New York City and see a supportive housing apartment that has a protected courtyard. And you can see over the privacy fence in this courtyard that other buildings are quite nearby. But giving residents a chance to have a sense of visual privacy, acoustic privacy, that they're not being looked at by others, can be one of many tools for managing stress. Next slide. The fifth human need is promoting a sense of community, which is a significant way to overcome trauma, from what I understand. Here we see in Burlington, Vermont, a day center where the dining space has been specifically designed to promote a sense of community and conversation. Round tables provide more of a sense of camaraderie and equality, while color here is brought into play to inject a sense of optimism. None of those things cost more. They just need some thought in order to include. Next slide, please. And beauty and meaning. We often don't talk about beauty and meaning, but I'm convinced it's one of the most important of these needs. As you can see here on the right, people will find ways to be beautiful or to have a sense of wonder about the natural environment in any way that they can. But there's many ways to express this through art programs, or even, as you see here on the left, uplighting onto wayfinding signs, which psychology tells us is more associated with optimism rather than lighting that is facing down. So there's a whole series of research studies that are starting to look at the unstated sort of subconscious aspects of architecture and what they can do for people's moods. Next slide, please. So just to give you a couple of transformations, which are kind of fun to look at, let me take you, next slide, please, to a shelter we recently worked with in Atlanta. This is the before image of the day center. It was a reconverted office building, which was totally razed to the ground and was reimagined using trauma-informed design principles. So this was the before, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see the after. Here you can see, with the dots especially, some specific trauma-informed design ideas. The orange dot showing residential style varied lighting to vary the mood. The yellow dot referring to different types of choice of seating styles to suit different types and sizes of bodies. And the pink dot showing a series of television screens that let somebody know if they will be permitted in that night. So a sense of transparency and fairness. Next slide, please. Here's the before image of an exterior courtyard where men would come to determine if they would be permitted into this shelter that night. And next slide, please, shows an idea for its transformation, literally using color to move the attention upward to a more optimistic state of mind and bringing in other sorts of seating amenities to promote privacy, to promote sense of control and choice and so forth. So again, none of this is particularly expensive, but I think it does alter the mood somewhat. Next slide, please. And lastly, here is an example of a single apartment for an adult. And this was the before images showing a very small apartment with probably a clutter of furniture. And the next slide, please, shows an vision for its redesign of giving more sense of personal control through storage and organization of possessions, giving people a chance to hang their backpacks and so forth, to have a sense of order and so forth. And you can see on the upper left a more disability-oriented version of this space. Next slide, please. So you can see there's a lot of different trauma-informed design techniques out there. So I encourage you to go to Design Resources for Homelessness and see what might help you with your next project. So thank you very much for this opportunity. The website is at the bottom there. And if I can help with anything, you'll find my, my email on the website as well. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jill. That was brilliant, fascinating. And thank you for setting the scene as well. So I'm just now going to hand over to Patricia, who will be talking about the psychological aspect.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. My name is Patricia and I work for Empowered Homes. So we are a property development company building psychologically informed homes. So rather than focus on the built environment interventions that we have developed, I'm going to focus on the psychology of trauma, as this is what informs our design process. So I'm going to refer to learning disabilities as I talk, but trauma really impacts many different cohorts that we design homes for. There are many considerations when designing homes for people with learning disabilities, but for this talk, I'm going to focus on trauma. So at Empowered Homes, we view the built environment as part of the therapeutic landscape. And I think when we view homes for people who have experienced trauma as therapeutic opportunities to support growth, recovery, and healing, then we can start to apply the psychology to the design process. And this view is critical for how we design, and it will also provide the framework for this presentation. So what is trauma? Well, trauma is often the result of going through an extremely stressful, frightening, threatening, and distressing event, which disrupts your sense of safety and self, and your ability to regulate your emotions and navigate relationships. And a series of traumatic and abusive events over a prolonged time is often associated with neurological changes, leading to what we call compound or complex trauma and crippling symptoms, such as chronic nightmares, paralyzing fear, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, isolation, emotional numbing, and dissociation. And I think it's really important to note that we all experience traumatic events in our lives, which we recover from. However, the population that we house and support, such as people with learning disabilities, chronic and enduring mental health difficulties, homelessness, survivors of childhood abuse and domestic abuse, are more likely to be suffering from compound trauma and PTSD type symptoms. Oh, sorry about that. So let's think about trauma and attachment. Well, a secure attachment is formed in infancy when our caregivers are responsive to our needs and represents a secure base from which to seek comfort and reassurance, develop and grow. People who have experienced traumatic events and trauma and abuse when they're younger often develop an insecure attachment styles. And that's when caregivers who should be trustworthy end up causing us harm, abuse, and neglect. And this inevitably interrupts our emotional development and often leads to people struggling in terms of how they regulate emotions, how they maintain meaningful relationships, and how they trust others. And this can often lead to a paradoxical longing for and pushing away of support and connection, which I think is a presentation a lot of staff see when caring for people with learning disabilities. Compound trauma and abuse creates an internalized threat-focused mind. So we mistrust everyone, we have a deep sense of worthlessness, we're always scanning the environment for danger, and we feel disconnected from others. And this all inhibits the development of what we call the self-compassionate mind. So what does all of this have to do with the design process? Well, is it possible for us to create a secure and trusting attachment relationship to the built environment? So an external secure base, if you will, from which we can feel emotionally and physically safe, which provides comfort, care, and shelter, that is reliable, consistent, and predictable, with clear boundaries and a sense of routine. So let's think a little bit about learning disabilities, more specifically in trauma. People with learning disabilities are at more risk of repeated experiences of abuse and traumatic events, such as sexual, verbal, and physical abuse. Sensory processing difficulties often makes experiencing the world traumatic. Life-threatening illnesses or injury not being included in the bereavement process, and placements away from home and family, and the use of restraint and hospitalization. They also may find it harder to make sense of and cope with trauma due to difficulties with problem solving and verbal skills, less sexual and financial knowledge, less understanding of what is appropriate and inappropriate behaviour from others, and often an insecure attachment style due to the loss of the healthy child and early parental separation, and less access to support, including online support. And I think people with learning disabilities are often excluded from conversations about trauma. And given how prevalent it is, I think we need to bring attention to it and really start talking about it. So what are some of the design considerations? Well, we know that when you've experienced trauma and abuse, your body boundary has been continuously disrespected. So clear and strong boundaries can make you feel safe in an otherwise unpredictable world. This can be particularly true for people with learning disabilities who are dependent on others and have little control or choice over how they live their lives. So designing opportunities for interacting needs to be graded and multifunctional, to give people choice regarding the degree to which they engage or are solitary, seen or hidden, and to minimise power differentials with staff can all empower and restore agency and trust. And I think we also need to design community spaces which accommodates the need for interdependence rather than just independence, which is a blend of dependency and self-sufficiency, and the view that growth and development rely on the need for connection and reliance on others. And I think the framework of independence in learning disabilities can sometimes ignore the importance of dependency in care seeking, but also the limits of independence, and that really it can look like supporting staff to include and participate people with learning disabilities in shared activities. So we know that trauma leaves a sticky imprint on how our nervous system sees the world. The threat-based sensations, emotions, and beliefs remain alive in our body way long after the event has passed. So what is our stress response? Well, the autonomic nervous system has two main branches: the sympathetic, which activates and mobilizes us into action, and the parasympathetic, which deactivates and immobilizes us into a state of rest and digest. And the two dysregulated states of the autonomic nervous system are hyperarousal, where we fight, flight, go into rage or feel overwhelmed, or hypoarousal, where we shut down, feel emotionally numb, become underwhelmed, and eventually disassociate. And importantly, when dysregulated, people are unable to access their thinking brain. They can't reflect, reason, process, problem solve, think into the future, or access their memory stores, as they are in defense mode. So compound trauma and an insecure attachment locks people in either hyper or hypoarousal, as their threat response becomes hyperactive. This causes persistent physiological stress, or an inability to talk, feeling isolated, collapsed, or sense of hopelessness, an inability to process stressful stimuli, or the risk of re-traumatization when higher stressors are present, and for the social engagement system to be blocked. And as you can see in this image, in between hyperarousal and hyperarousal, we have another arousal state, which we call the window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance is a nervous system state and a way of conceptualizing our bandwidth or capacity to tolerate intense emotions at the sympathetic end and the parasympathetic end. So in essence, the window of tolerance refers to our optimal zone of arousal. It's a place where we are regulated and we can interact and connect with others. So we are calm and alert. Our emotional and logical brains are working in tandem. We are capable of self-reflection, social engagement, and to make plans. And we can adapt and process intense emotions and respond to the demands and stresses of everyday life without too much strain. And I think it's really important here to say that people with learning disabilities and neurodivergent people often have a narrower window of tolerance. This can be due to a vulnerable neurology and sensory systems, and a history also of compound trauma and insecure attachment bonds. So again, how does all of this relate to the design process? Well, given what we know about trauma and the nervous system, can we design in a way that helps people regulate their arousal? Can we enable the safe release of strong negative emotions? Can we modulate sensory input in order to mitigate against triggers? Can we design a communicative environment, one that is predictable and comprehensive, with the use of visual cues to orientate people when they're aroused and their thinking brain is offline? And I think another really interesting way of looking at this is through the lens of co-regulation, which is adjusting how you interact with another in order to maintain a regulated state, such as having a warm, calming presence and tone of voice, verbally acknowledging someone's distress, modeling of behaviors that can modulate arousal. And importantly for this conversation, it's the provision of a structured environment that supports emotional and physical safety. So can the environment co-regulate with an individual's nervous system? I think it's really important for us to pause here and for me to reinforce that people are unable to activate their social engagement system and thus seek meaningful, loving connections unless they widen their window of tolerance. And we all know that relationships are key to healing trauma and insecure attachment styles, whether that's with family, friends, or indeed with staff. So how do we widen the window of tolerance through design? Well, self-compassion is often seen as an antidote to trauma, threat, and shame. And the literature suggests that we need to first strengthen our self-compassion system, so be in our optimal safe arousal zone, in order to then manage strong, difficult emotions as they arise and to integrate past trauma. So how can we foster an intimate, safe, and caring relationship with the building that communicates compassionate messages such as "you matter" and "we care"? And I think Jill has touched on this in her speech, and it's really about designing a home which respects people's privacy, a space that communicates respect, dignity, and hope, increases choice and agency, has a homely domestic feel, and one in which you can see yourself positively reflected in the physical environment, and that also considers staff spaces so they too can stay in their optimal zone rather than match somebody's arousal state, and also engage in reflective practices so they can prioritize forming meaningful relationships with the people they support. So in summary, if the built environment can attend to the nervous system, balance extreme arousal states, and design opportunities for safe, graded social interactions, then the social engagement system can come online. The environment suddenly becomes part of the therapeutic landscape. It is safe, caring, and regulating, contributing towards the conditions needed for meaningful connections and relationships, which we know is vital for healthy functioning and trauma healing. Thank you very much. Please get in touch to hear more.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patricia. That's absolutely fascinating again. That's great. I'm learning so much today. That is excellent. Yeah, it's great to have the clinical psychologist perspective really on the and pointing out the importance of designing, regulating arousal in people. And so yeah, fascinating. But I'm going to hand over to Mark and Catherine now. But before you start, I'd just like to remind everybody to please post your questions in the Q&A box, and so that we can have a great conversation later. Fantastic. All right, over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much. It's a hard act to follow coming after Jill and Patricia, but I'm going to do my best. Sorry, I just need to share.
Are you having some?
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Go. That's it.
Yeah, that's great. It's up.
So, I'm Catherine Gundry, Design Associate at West Waddy Archadia. We are a multidisciplinary practice working in planning, architecture and urban design. We look at sustainability from different angles, and one key aspect is the social sustainability and designing people-centric places. As you've heard, trauma-informed practice is becoming increasingly prevalent in healthcare and is often now cited in policy. But this is still seems to be an area which has not fully been developed, even down to the definition. And there's a whole document on the government website about what the definition is in the UK context. When we started working with Patricia and Jill, we really wanted to get an understanding of the broad strokes in their experience, background and practice. From here, we were able to come up with kind of principles which apply to the architectural field. When working with Patricia, we had a really open discussion and kind of covering her speech today to kind of define what the problem we saw was, and then to propose what the solution might be. We tried to narrow the scope and first focus on key areas, define their specific requirements, and then work to understand the interventions that could assist with the healing process. I'd like to highlight that this presentation is examples of solutions. It's not definitive, and there is no one size fits all approach. This is just a few bespoke proposals that we've been working on. So you've heard it again and again, what is trauma-informed design? At its broadest level in terms of architecture, it's about promoting healing, improving the physical and mental health. When looking at interventions proposed, you're balancing two almost conflicting needs: to allow safe spaces to retreat, but also encouraging interaction. This is where we worked a lot looking at Jill's research and the idea that has come from that, the 3 C's. So choice, emphasising individual access, agency and ownership. Community responds to the way a resident may engage with staff, other residents and guests to facilitate relationship building, as Patricia pointed out. And comfort includes aspects such as quality of and variety of materials, the sensory experience from light, sound and smell, the elements such as nature and artwork, which can bring calm and spark joy. The 3 C's are fundamental to the recommendations of our design brief. And when looking at different individual physical elements, the overall aim is to kind of meet these 3 C's, but also enhance them. When looking at the lens of learning disabilities, you're also trying to understand the sensory and cognitive aspects of universal design. So now I'll run through a few examples of areas and considerations the report highlights. But let's start at the community level. So initially, when we started this work, we looked at user journeys and tried to understand the importance to the individual. When looking at the building or the project, it doesn't stop at the red line, unfortunately. And the impact of a project can have so much importance to its surroundings, and sometimes they're outside of your control, but it's a massively important consideration. A key aspect we considered is the permeability of the frontage, wanting to be inviting to the public whilst maintaining privacy and safety of the residents. This is where choice is fundamental, allowing and promoting spaces for private reflection, but also spaces for safe interactions. An important assumption is that there is a transitional external space, so a front garden, which works to move you from the kind of the public realm to the semi-public realm. This space should be safe, with passive overlooking to allow staff to keep an oversight of this area, but also to allow views into spaces prior to entering in either direction. So a few examples are here. Look at the permeability of boundaries, the transition spaces, and how you can do that through the integration of benches into walls to provide the facility to sit on either side. So it's important, it's about that kind of connection and the option to interact. Keeping entrances screened in a way, but also visible. So like I said, there's some kind of conflicting elements. So the idea that there's a sense of privacy, but the building is still legible. And then maximizing light into the building, as well as using it as a strategy to create views which promote safety and security. As Patricia said, staff areas are kind of one of the very, very important areas, and I think they can become afterthoughts in design. To create a good environment and improve staff retention rates, which is a very important point at this juncture, the spaces should be designed carefully with consideration and thought around people who would work there and what their role is. Trauma-informed care looks at the individual care plans and bespoke staffing approaches. To understand how these spaces are designed, first we need to look at what the needs are and how they're used. So spaces, there are a variety of spaces you need: public-facing ones, semi-public for meetings, and private for reflection. The entrance should be connected to a space where one-to-one conversations can be had with residents and their family. Historically in offices, I'm sure Patricia would agree, there's a lot of paperwork floating around in a lot of care offices. And without storage, it's very easy to lose paperwork and not have it kind of safe and secure. So it's a very key consideration looking at storage and how we can declutter spaces. So when we're looking at these elements, we must consider there is a need for the user and their uses. So a selection of spaces is required for work and relaxation, making sure there are a variety of sizes and easy to use multiple spaces simultaneously. Keeping the spaces free of clutter, maximising storage, it really promotes a better working environment and is safer with the nature of the documents. The aim is to reduce staff stress through spaces which are fit for purpose and designed with a clear intent. Technology should be integrated into schemes, but it's fundamental that staff are trained on how to use it. This would allow safe storage of information and ease of access for meetings. One of the things we looked at as an example was two-way glass and whether it can be used to reduce stress on residents in key locations. One of the things that came out of COVID was the idea of wobble rooms in some care facilities. These should be considered kind of a priority. There is space to reflect and centre yourself and also look to work on reflective practice. Understanding that a space isn't infinite is often an architect's role, and we can't carry on building and building more area. So it's the idea of keeping flexibility in spaces, dividing them up and making sure that you can use them simultaneously. I say sometimes there are spaces which are forgotten, and these are the travelling spaces like corridors or the needed rooms like the laundry. They are sometimes left undesigned, when ironically, often these spaces are the areas where interaction with others is high. They need to be designed to accommodate and understand these interactions. With people who have experienced trauma, the unknown can be difficult. Unexpected interactions can trigger a negative response, but through a little thought, these could be reduced. A key aspect in LD and trauma is sightlines, reducing the unexpected. This can be internal and external. So with windows, you can both give views out, but also allow views into the next space and create light, open areas. Passing points are often missed out, but can play key roles. They can be spaces to rest, to promote interaction. They can be spaces to calm down and avoid confrontation. Through careful design of corridors, you can change this transitional space and make it more than a corridor and an extension of the communal areas. A few of the key considerations and examples are breakout spaces, passing points in corridors and communal areas, but also looking at how rooms are designed to make sure you have two entrances with visibility. This allows people to avoid triggers such as feeling trapped when someone else potentially enters a room. Trying to open up views through glazing, but also chamfering corners, providing long sight lines, again, can reduce that fear of the unknown. So moving into communal areas, we really wanted to consider empowerment and choice in these spaces. There should be a decision on how and who you interact with. The home aesthetic allows a sense of ownership. It's important to keep away from that institutional feel through the colours, artwork, furnishing and materials, as Jill and Patricia have pointed out. Some of the key elements to consider would be how a space feels. The furnishing, both in their design, but also in their arrangement. I think Jill's examples were phenomenal for this, looking at how you anchor furniture within a space. Using the environment to cue activity, like Patricia said. So you could be changing tablecloths to show social cues, or changing floor finishes to signal a transition of spaces. Looking at sightlines to allow kind of that mental preparation before entering a space is fundamental to the communal areas, but also having communal areas of different sizes to allow for different groups as well as individuals. Integration of nature is something that Patricia touched on with biophilia, and this can be through gardens and courtyards as well as in internal spaces. So some of the examples that can be seen are looking at different types of garden space to give year-round greenery and allow for interaction both with other people but also with your senses. Also, understanding the senses is essential in these communal areas. How does it smell? How does it feel? How does it sound? Working with texture and light to create spaces which are calming. For the user, having power over their own space is essential. So looking at the private spaces within a care setting. For many trauma sufferers, they have experience with institutional settings. Therefore, having a space which is comfortable and they can personalize empowers them. Organization and storage can help create calm spaces which do not overwhelm and declutter the mind. When looking at private spaces, it is essential to look at the lighting, review its consistency, the intensity and the colors. How the space can be personalized using colors of lighting or colors in artwork. Integration of technology to provide assistance and structure. Keeping a domestic feel in spaces like the kitchen and the bathroom, and avoiding triggers where possible through good acoustic design to separate you from your neighbours and the communal spaces. Key examples again come back to embracing technology. I know I've said technology a few times today. These elements, I do think often do come to price on projects, but they are an opportunity that should not be missed. One of the things we looked at is the use of smart mirrors and lighting. This can help people to communicate their feelings through the light, the colour, but also assist them with schedules and keep them up to date on what is going on in communal areas. Cueing can be really important in learning disabilities. To look at ways to communicate beyond the verbal is essential. And this is something we looked at with kind of lighting, which could change colour. It's paramount to avoid the institutional triggers and make sure there's a feeling that it's domestic and safe. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mark. So thanks for listening, and Mark will take you through the next few slides.
Hello, everyone. And yeah, so I think it's important to highlight what Catherine said at the beginning of her presentation, that these design interventions are not necessarily the solutions for each and every project. So we're not saying that trauma-informed design is putting an interactive mirror in your scheme. It comes down to very personal to the individual and the group of people you're designing for. And I know that's something that right at the beginning of when Patricia and I first started talking on this subject, there was a lot of back and forth about, well, how can we make it as personalized as possible, while still having obviously there's commercial sensitivities around development to be considered as well. So I think that's been something that we've really looked to work on over the past year or so now. I've been thinking about frameworks for different individual groups, just because it's important to understand the different resident profiles that are going to live in these homes. So I think in a similar vein, it's important to think about the individual's journey through the building and using the visual cues as Catherine set out to set expectations and provide certainty. This particularly when going through those transitional spaces, so hallways, corridors from your private area to perhaps a more communal area. And I think it's really important, as Patricia touched on, that people are within their safe zone in their homes. I think everyone should expect to feel safe in their own home. And I think we've got to remember that when designing these supported living schemes. So next slide, please. So it's also important to understand each space and how people will be using it and the activities taking place. So a really good brief at the beginning of the project's really important. Then you can design those spaces to have key characteristics and qualities, and are designed in a trauma-informed, using a trauma-informed approach. It's really important to have clear boundaries from public to private, and that can be expressed in a variety of ways through floor finishes, perhaps lighting, perhaps the artwork changes that's on the wall, just to give people that safety and security of what's happening next, or at least gives them an idea if they're not 100% certain. Next slide, please. So really pleased to be publishing this piece today. So it's available through the HousingLIN, as Jerome said at the beginning of the presentation, also through our website. A really big thanks to Patricia, I think, for involving us within this field. It's been, I've learned a lot, definitely, over the last year, and it's still evolving. And thanks to Jill as well for her work. I know that she, Patricia used her for inspiration, so did we, and the work that she's been doing for a number of years in this field has provided a really good grounding for our own work. And I think the really important thing that I've learned is how the built environment can positively affect health outcomes, all stemming from trauma-informed care. I think that's really important point to make when you're designing involved in these projects, that you can really have a positive impact on people's lives. And we also really appreciate any feedback, questions you have. Please put them in the Q&A now, or if you don't, we'll have contact details at the end, and the document itself has a link to feedback if you'd like to complete that as well in a different time frame. That's also fine. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch on the next steps as well, because at the moment we've done a lot of work on the theory, and it's going to be about getting these ideas into the built environment and essentially seeing what works, what doesn't, and then evolving that, really. So we're currently working with Empowered Homes, a number of different projects at different stages. That's an example of one on the right is in Birmingham. So that's due to start on site imminently. It's 22 apartments with communal areas. So there's lots of transitions, fairly sizable scheme for sort of a group such as this. So we're looking forward to seeing how the sort of theory goes with that project. There's quite a lot of need in Birmingham. I think there's 8,000 supported housing properties in Birmingham currently. And I'm sure you've seen on the news that they're not all well designed. And there's actually a really good program on Channel 4 at the moment called 60 Days in the Estates. I'd recommend you check that out. It has some supported housing featured, and there's some, it's sort of a, I don't know who the presenter is, but he goes around and he visits different people in their situation in their homes. And I think one piece was really resonated with me in relation to this research. So he went into a sort of shared HMO property, and one of the residents he was chatting with basically said he didn't spend any time in the house. He just came there and used it almost like a hotel, didn't go into the kitchen because he didn't feel, you know, safe and secure to interact with people. So that's the I think that shows the type of vulnerabilities that we're sort of dealing with on these projects. And I think it's really important that we try and provide them with perhaps better accommodation than some that's out there at the moment. So next slide. So yeah, just to finalize really, so we're going to build on this document with case studies with Empowered. We're going to review how these design interventions worked. We'll do that through post-occupancy evaluation, and then we'll look to obviously publish those through the HousingLIN, and maybe we'll come back maybe in, I guess it'll be a couple of years by the time things are built and up and running and things. We've had time to have a bit of a review of it, and we'll come and share our findings. So I think it's really important that the research turns into real life projects, and I think Jill's a shining example of that in her work. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Right. Thank you. That was brilliant. Great presentations. So it's now time to move to the Q&A session. So we've had a few questions being asked in the Q&A box. So maybe I will start with a question that was actually posted in the chat box by Claire Skidmore. So to the speakers, do you take account in your research and projects of work undertaken by autistic and neurodiverse people about the impact of the environment on people with additional sensory needs and differences? So I don't know who wants to start on this one.
I can share that I am not an expert in neurodiversity and would not claim to be one. However, I gave a presentation with an expert back in 2021 where we looked at both trauma-informed design and neurodiverse tactics. And I pulled up my presentation from that time when I saw this question, and her main 3 points were: a space needs to be adaptable, a space needs to empower, which has some overlap with trauma-informed design, and especially a space needs to be transparent with its intent and its amenities and so forth. So I know that's a very small answer, but just some ideas.
Okay.
I think if okay, I'll jump in next then.
Yes, please.
I think we had a plethora of research that we used as a foundation for all of the kind of interventions we've suggested. Obviously, PASS 6463, Design for the Mind, is something that we've looked into extensively. And I think a lot of the principles we've used can be applied across all tenure types. So kind of universal principles around lighting, acoustics, and I think they benefit a wide range of user groups, not specific to kind of the neurodiversity sector. When looking at this, we did look at specific aspects, I'd say, that were more in line with this user group. So a lot of that, like Patricia touched on, is about queuing. And I think, as well as being a part of the trauma-informed design principles, is really useful in that LD space and neurodiverse space, having those cues within the environment. But I think what we tried to do is understand it in an architectural way as well. So looking at it from a materiality point of view, instead of potentially looking at it specifically from that neurodiverse perspective, we looked at how can you have homely materials, but also have something that cues a space, so you know that you're moving from one space to another. I think Mark, Patricia, and I have had many meetings where we went into depth about the minutiae of detail, and then we had to kind of almost rein it back at some points at the different stages to make sure that we were looking at those broad strokes initially and that universal design approach to make sure it was appropriate for all as well as the specific user group. Mark, would you like to kind of add on to that?
Yeah, I think through work with Patricia, we developed a framework for different groups of people, and we are in the process of working out what design interventions are appropriate for those different groups. And then I think there'll be an assessment of whether it's appropriate to have, maybe certain design interventions are appropriate for more than one group, but we haven't fully tested it yet, is what I would say. And that's something we're looking to do over the sort of coming months.
I would just quickly add with a definite yes for neurodivergence. And I think this is where OTs are kind of gold dust really in terms of sensory processing and their expertise in that area. And I think it's not really that dissimilar to kind of how I described the nervous system response. So I think when you're designing spaces for sensory processing difficulties, so people who struggle to modulate their sensory input, I think it's important to know whether somebody is more kind of hyper or hypo, so that whether they need down regulating or up regulating, and how we can create kind of opportunities for both of those in the environment, whether that's through tactile sensory walls or panels, or kind of a sensory garden, or the creation of sensory circuits within the environment that can allow for that kind of the opportunity to modulate sensory input through the environment, I think is key. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I will pick another question. So there's a question from Duncan May. So we are looking at accommodation for clients living high support mental health accommodation into interim accommodation to get tenancy ready for general needs housing. Any advice on design for this accommodation? We are at the design stage now before it is built. So it's a bit of a hard one, but
Can I start? Is that all right? I know Mark
yes.
and Patricia will have a lot on this, I'm sure, and Jill.
Mhm.
I think one of the great things about what we've done so far is it's not specific to new build, and that throughout different accommodation types, existing and new build, there are things that can be implemented. So stuff like the technology aspect, I think that can be implemented into different tenure sets. So also into kind of that general needs housing sector, and that can help facilitate a more calming environment. At the design stage, I think if you can implement some of the key architectural principles as well, that's a great opportunity. So where we're talking about kind of the acoustics, the lighting, those physical elements, if they can be integrated at the design stage, it means in the long term you've kind of already going in the right direction to achieving those goals. And then you can look at those other interventions and retrofit solutions in general needs housing, which kind of give a consistency. So when moving from a high support housing sector into general needs, what is the consistency of offering which can reduce trauma and also can help support the individual to feel like they are independent and can kind of have that same standard of lifestyle in their new home.
Yeah, so just to pick up, I think that independence point's really important. I mean, I guess that's the sort of transitionary steps that these people are going through. And I think it's really important to try and personalize that interim accommodation as much as possible to that individual. So it doesn't feel like it's, you know, an institutional stepping stone. I think if you're gonna if people are then going to move to general needs where they'll probably have less support, they're going to need to be able to feel comfortable in their own homes. So I think trying to get those comfort levels correct in the interim accommodation is really important, and giving them the opportunity to personalize those spaces would be really beneficial as a starting point.
Okay. Jill or Patricia, you want to add anything?
I think I would just add, if you're having a situation where you're changing the person types who are going to be inhabiting your dwellings, and you're moving from one, collection of indicators to another, I think I would be careful about the perceptions of the residents in terms of making those changes. What I mean by that is, if you're moving from a situation of more control in terms of more needing to establish more help with, outbursts or those kinds of things, if you were to then change it to a group of people who need that less, there is a certain stigma attached to, say, furnishings that look like they can't be thrown, or things that seem overly sensitive, such as anti-ligature hooks on the walls that would keep somebody from hanging themselves. If you're moving to a situation where that's less of an issue, I'd be really careful about what signals the existing design is sending and try to mitigate those as much as possible.
Yeah, good point.
I guess just to add to that from a psychology perspective, I guess in terms of increasing the window of tolerance, I would just add to what Jill's saying. If they've gone from one environment to another less kind of contained environment, if you will, that we really need to kind of prioritize strengthening somebody's zone of arousal in the kind of ways we've all touched on in the presentation, I think is really key. And also, I think, just going back to Jill's presentation again, the kind of standards that she had, or the principles that she had, I guess we're talking about it very much from a perspective of trauma, but a lot of the built environment interventions would help with general well-being, not just trauma, so they can be applied regardless, and they're still going to improve somebody's overall health.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the murkiest areas that we wrestle with, which is going to be difficult to untangle, is this notion of triggers, of signals that a piece of furniture or a finish or the width of a hallway or the height of a ceiling are sending to people that we may or may not have been able to anticipate. And we're not going to be able to specifically, design every space to suit every person, but there are certain things we probably need to be aware of. A classic example is so many spaces in the United States use metal beds because they help with bed bugs and so forth, which is fine. But quite often those metal beds are painted black. And, you know, that's a choice that's just kind of a default that nobody thinks about. But black bunk beds and black metal have sort of associations with jail.
Yeah.
So beds don't have to be painted black. You know, if you're going to be acquiring beds in quantity, you can ask the manufacturer to paint them whatever color you wish, probably with no extra money. So there are certain sort of universal things and triggers that we want to be aware of that may not be a huge outlay of money to change.
Yeah, very good point as well. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question. From Catherine Campbell. So it's a question about funding, really. So it's she says really impressive designs, shows that a lot of space is needed for well-designed schemes, which is of course more expensive. Can you give any examples of how trauma-informed schemes have been funded? Do you have any examples you can share with us? Maybe Mark and Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our experience, it's a melting pot of funding. I mean, obviously within Empowered Homes, there's some private funding that goes into that. There's also the, local authority might provide grant for this type of housing as well, potentially Homes England. There's normally a melting pot of funding on every project I've ever worked on. So I think to pin it down to, a single point of funding, I'm not aware of any specific funding for this type of work as such. But I think it's generally a case of speaking to the local commissioners and whoever you're partnering up with on the care front as well.
I think also there are certain amounts of the research which, like Jill was saying, colour schemes and things like that, which can have a massive effect without having a massive cost associated. Obviously, the higher end, like the technologies, everyone having an interactive mirror is going to be expensive, and that might not be appropriate in all situations depending on the user group. But having an understanding that some of these lower cost interventions can make all the difference, I think, is a fundamental thing to take away. So when we were working on just the graphics of the document, we spoke to Jill, and Jill said about anchoring furniture and making sure that they had that understanding. And that's more of there's some areas which are more interior than architecture, I'd say, but they can also have a massive effect on trauma-informed design. So even if you don't have a lot of funding, you can make fundamental changes in how you look at spaces, which will improve those spaces.
In the United States, I work with projects that are either renovations or coming out of the ground as sort of a user experience advocate. I'm not the interior designer, I'm not the architect, but I'm really more sitting alongside those professionals to offer ideas and reminders about how we're designing for people. And some of the funding is public-private. Some of the projects I showed you today were public-private ventures. Others are very dependent on grants. And interestingly, I'm finding that grant seekers, which are the support organizations, are increasingly relying on research evidence where it's appropriate to put in their grant proposals to show the evidence and backing for some of these trauma-informed design ideas. So I think, as it is typically done, design and the needs of users and the needs of support organizations are leading our grant providers in terms of what kind of way we design, specifically with trauma-informed design. So I think we need to continue to provide to those grant providers an edge in our proposals that try to tap, research where we possibly can.
Yeah, I would just agree that I think for Empowered Homes, designing in a kind of trauma-informed or psychological informed way is very much embedded in our processes from start to finish. So we don't see it as an extra cost or kind of an add-on at the end of something that we've already done. It's very much part of our process, our internal process. You know, we're constantly looking at whatever space is presented, whether that's small, restricted, large. You know, we're always looking through that lens, through a psychological lens, through a trauma-informed lens. So it doesn't really matter on the size of the space, or as kind of Jill's saying, you know, the budget or you know, the expense of it. It's just kind of part and parcel of how we would approach and engage with the building and design from the ground up, and also interact and engage with the different kind of players, whether that's commissioning or care. And I think a lot of it goes down to, I'm just reiterating really, but a lot of it is down to consideration. So it's about, you know, how you consider a space, and it'd be such a subtle difference or intervention that can make all the difference. I think is really key. Yeah.
I'm really fascinated that a lot of this comes down to, you know, the moment to moment human experience of, you know, where does somebody put their shoes on when they go to the bathroom at night? How are they going to read in bed? You know, how are they going to go through the process of taking their laundry to the laundry room to do it? What are they doing while they're waiting? And I think this kind of action analysis can really show, you know, where trauma-informed design can have its greatest impact. Sometimes it's the big stuff like the widths of hallways and, you know, the style of the entrance to buildings, but sometimes it's the achingly small stuff too, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I think Patricia, I don't know where she's gone, but she had a really interesting story. I think it was about she was working with a young adult, I think it was, and you know, the room that they were moving into wasn't that great, and then I think it was the mother that came along and put this load of soft furnishings everywhere. Is that correct, Patricia? And it just sort of changed things immensely. Just, you know, simple changes like that are zero cost really, to a certain extent can still make you know, a place more comfortable for people.
In terms of the other people who are living in these places, do you have any experience or examples of employing co-production in order to in the design process? Is it something you have any experience or knowledge of? Something that
Are you asking if we involving residents in the design process? Is that your question?
Yes, yeah, pretty much, yeah.
I'm a big advocate of that. I try to, you know, ask that at least one or more residents is present and giving their feedback. Honestly, the longer I'm in this area, the less I see that I'm able to totally empathize with what it is like to be in this situation. And I think having somebody who's living that experience is really important to uncovering sometimes small or big things that may not have had the light of day before. So yeah, I'm an advocate.
Okay.
Yeah, I think yeah, I'm an advocate as well. I think on the Empowered Home Scheme so far, we haven't known who the residents are going to be, so that's made that slightly more challenging. So we haven't been able to do any co-production on these schemes, but we have done it on other schemes in the past, and we'll do in the future. And I think that's part of this the post-occupancy evaluation as well. So perhaps you can't co-produce at the inception, but at least you can get the feedback into the next design, which isn't quite as, you know, as good necessarily. But it's something if you don't know who the residents are going to be when you're designing these buildings.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. It's already 5:15. It's gone so quickly. I'm sorry for all the questions that have been asked that we haven't had a chance to answer, but I'm sure there'll be other opportunities for that. So yeah, I'd like to thank all our speakers today. It was absolutely brilliant. I learned a lot. I'm looking forward to going back to the recording and your presentations. So Sally will be in touch with all our delegates to let you know when the recording and the slides are available on our website, so you can go back to it. So lastly, I'd just like to say that our next happy hour is going to be held on the 4th of July, and we'll be taking an international look at independent living. So we'll be drawing on examples from Canada, and we'll also be joined by Professor Julian Meyer, who is the Older People Housing Task Force Chair. So we hope to see you there. And I'd like once again to thank all our speakers. And yeah, have a wonderful evening and see you all soon.
I just wanted to
Oh, yes.
I just wanted to quickly say some of these questions that I'm reading are really interesting and fascinating. And if anyone wants to send their questions over to me or to Mark via email, I'm very happy to answer them at a later date. Yeah, thank you, Patricia, for raising that. Yes, if you'd like to ask our speakers any questions, I propose you just send them to our info@housinglin.org.uk inbox, and we'll forward your questions to our speakers so they can answer directly. Excellent, thank you. And before I say goodbye once again, I should have asked Mark, Catherine, or Patricia, Jill, is there any last word you'd like to say?
Thank you for your interest, and thank you for the work you're doing. I'm sure it's making the world a much better place.
Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.